In the last lecture, we spoke about Sino-Soviet relations, and here we're going to talk about Sino-American relations during the Cold War. If we want to go back to World War II, the United States supported both the Communist Party of China and the Kuomintang in fighting the Japanese. Obviously, during the course of World War II, our biggest goal was to defeat the Axis power, so we would be willing to ally with communist allies. Most of that support, however, went to Chiang Kai-shek and his Kuomintang party. Following the war, we continued to support the Kuomintang. We considered them anti-communist, and during the Cold War, that was good enough for us. Now, in 1949, the Chinese communists win the Civil War, or the Civil War in China, and the United States will refuse to recognize this new People's Republic of China, the Communist China, as a legitimate state, and continue to support Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists who had been exiled to the nearby island of Taiwan. We also see Taiwanese nationalists will be granted China's seat on the UN Security Council. So this, in the early years of this relationship between between the United States and China, a main area of dispute is going to be with the region of Taiwan. Secondary issues going forward will be Korea and Japan and Tibet, all other regional issues. So in 1950, we see tensions increasing between the United States and China. You might recall that when China initially fell to communists, the United States was largely uninterested, as we saw the focus of the Cold War being squarely on Moscow and the Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe. However, with the blowback that Harry Truman's administration received from Joe McCarthy and others like him, China became a greater issue. In 1950, the People's Liberation Army, that's Communist China's army, invaded the region of Tibet on the southwestern border of China. Mao considered this a domestic concern, not a foreign policy issue, not a foreign invasion. That territory was, at historic points, a portion of China. The Tibetan spiritual leader, the Dalai Lama, would flee Tibet, and he considered Mao's actions cultural genocide, and the United States supports that claim, or has historically supported that claim. Next, with the Korean War from 1950 to 1953, the United States sees the North Korean invasion as under the direction of Mao and Stalin as a joint venture. China, however, was not as supportive of the move at the outset. As we know, the People's Republic of China was not concerned at the time with a divided Korea, and their primary concerns were Tibet and Taiwan. They wanted to consolidate control within mainland China and reunite Taiwan and China. The Soviet Union was boycotting the United Nations over the United States' refusal to accept Communist China onto the Security Council, so there could be no veto of this United Nations action in the Security Council. So remember, the Korean War then was in fact not just an American war, it was a United Nations war. Mao would condemn the U.S. actions in Korea, calling the United States aggressors and imperialist invaders, and gave warnings to the United States not to push into the North. In October of 1950, American forces under General Douglas MacArthur would in fact push over the 38th parallel, and the People's Republic of China would ultimately declare war on the United States and send troops across the Yalu River to fight the Americans and the South Koreans and other UN forces. After 3 years of fighting, the People's Liberation Army lost nearly 1 million men. The results of this Korean War? Well, previously the United States had been reluctant to offer long-term protection for Taiwan, as we saw our interests lying squarely in Europe rather than in Asia. And now the United States will pledge to defend the nation of Taiwan. Hostility between the United States and the People's Republic of China becomes a key factor in international relations. China is going to be weakened, both economically and in terms of loss of life. And it's going to cause a rift between the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China, as Mao in China was made to foot the entire bill for the war. Now, with regards to Taiwan, this is, remember, where the nationalists had fled following the end of the Chinese Civil War. Mao Zedong greatly wanted to finish the nationalists off and reunite Taiwan with mainland China. And actually, Mao Zedong never considered Taiwan to even be separate from mainland China. In 1950, we see that Harry Truman would make comments that the United States had no desire to establish military bases on Taiwan, and he considered it a factor of Chinese civil strife. That was in 1950. However, with the Korean War coming and going, the American policy is going to shift, and by 1953, Taiwan will be considered a key territory of American policy of containment in Asia. On multiple occasions, both in 1954 and in 1958, Mao Zedong will attempt to test the level of the United States' commitment towards Taiwan. In each case, shelling small islands off the coast of China that were considered to be part of Taiwan. President Eisenhower responded very strongly, threatening nuclear weapons. Remember the notion of brinkmanship during the Eisenhower administration and his new look against communism. He threatened the use of nuclear weapons if Taiwan was directly threatened. He would push again in 1958, after the initial 1954 attack, shelling more islands and building up troops along his coast, even firing upon ships of the United States Navy in the straits, in the Formosa Straits, which separates mainland China from Taiwan. The United States prepared for war in Asia here, but full-scale attack never came. The United States saw the People's Republic of China as an expansionist state, and we linked them to the domino theory, so a direct threat to the security of the West. And from here on out, the United States is going to embark on a strict containment of not only the Soviet Union, but also China. We place a trade embargo with the People's Republic of China. We obstruct the People's Republic of China's entry into the United Nations. We start pumping huge economic and military aid into Taiwan. We create a regional containment bloc to mirror NATO in Europe called SEATO, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. And we create a number of bilateral defense treaties with other Asian nations that we see as under communist threat from China. During the 1960s, the American policy of containment and isolation of China continued. We saw the Great Leap Forward and the failure of it as highlighting the problems that China suffered under, and also the failures of Marxism. But then in the 1960s, we also see issues with Vietnam and decolonization movements around the world, as well as Taiwan continuing to be an issue, with China continuing to demand for reunification with Taiwan. There would never be a return to the brink of war as we saw in 1958, but no compromises would be made either. With regard to the Vietnam conflict, the People's Republic of China would condemn American actions in Vietnam as being colonialist imperialism. As for the decolonization movements that picked up steam in the 1960s, China supported revolutionary decolonization movements in many developing countries, especially in Africa and some in Latin America. And they were hoping to replace the Soviet Union. If you recall, they've got the Sino-Soviet split. They were hoping to replace the Soviet Union as the leader of international communist revolutions. And publicly, Mao Zedong is speaking out against the United States as being the key danger to world peace. Our policies towards China in the 1960s would be to not seek to overthrow the People's Republic of China. You would recall that, one, hundreds of millions of people, massive population, and that would be a challenging proposition, especially if we couldn't even do it in Cuba. And two, by this time in 1966, China is a nuclear power. We publicly object to China's involvement in other nations, though we recognize that China is far more violent in their words than in their actions. So we are keeping a watchful eye on them, but we don't see them as truly threatening. More bite or bark than bite, I should say. China still lacked the resources to play a major part in global decolonization movements. With the Chinese Cultural Revolution starting in 1966, we see it the same way as the Soviet Union, as out-of-control Maoist fanaticism. And in China, anti-U.S. rhetoric would increase, along with paranoia in China that the United States or the Soviet Union would attack the People's Republic of China. This climate would change in the 1970s with the détente period of the Cold War. Now, with regard to détente for the United States, our rationale for it is we were seeing that around the world containment might be failing. Our containment policy wasn't doing very well, especially with regard to the war in Vietnam, and that we thought China could actually help us with regard to exiting from Vietnam. We hoped that maybe coming closer with the Chinese might pressure a U.S.-Soviet détente as well. President Nixon wanted to make history, wanted to change the way the United States had been operating for the last few decades. Public support for there was great public support for more constructive strategies following the Vietnam War to avoid other conflicts like that. There's also the realization that China, just like the Soviet Union, has intercontinental ballistic missile capabilities, and it's more dangerous to not talk with China than it is to talk. And we hoped that we could reduce our commitments to other Asian nations that we might see as threatened by China. If we could reduce our commitments, we might be able to bring some troops home and have less financial obligation in Asia. The rationale for China to have an easing of tensions with the United States is that by this time in the 1970s, China sees the Soviet Union as their main rival, and they wanted to reduce tensions with the United States. Hopefully, according to China, they could gain foreign policy concessions, and maybe that a détente would be temporary, playing their enemies, the Americans and the Soviets, off of each other. And they hoped that this would bring them improved international standing, especially towards other third world nations. So these are what the United States and China wanted. How would they actually come to some kind of agreements? This would come in the form of what's known as ping-pong diplomacy, where American table tennis teams were invited to China to compete against Chinese teams. And while that was occurring, secret talks would take place in the background between American Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and his Chinese counterpart Zhou Enlai. Through these negotiations, it was agreed that there would be an easing of trade restrictions between the United States and China, and this is when the United States will start actually seeing those infamous Made in China tags on products imported into the United States. The Americans will agree to recognize the People's Republic of China in the United Nations. Initially, there would be two Chinas represented, with the People's Republic of China on the Security Council and Taiwan in the General Assembly. That was the initial plan, but this was not accepted by either party. Ultimately, the People's Republic of China would be the one recognized China by the United Nations. And now China again, Communist China, has veto power and the prestige from being a permanent Security Council member. The United States also supported a slow move towards reunification with China. China would receive full diplomatic relations with the United States under President Carter in 1979, and the United States would at least temporarily stop arms sales to Taiwan. In 1980, with the election of President Ronald Reagan, tensions would be renewed with China over Taiwan as American arms sales to the Taiwanese and some trade protections returned. Now, Nixon, for his part in 1972, certainly did make history by becoming the first American president to actually travel to Beijing, and he met with Mao Zedong. And this is quite a turn from the Mao from 10 years before, who was chastising Nikita Khrushchev for not pushing for all-out nuclear war with the United States. And now Mao is inviting Richard Nixon to China and to meet with and sign agreements with. Despite this cooling off period of the 1970s and the early 1980s, there will never be the vitriol that we would see in the 60s, or that we saw in the 60s between the United States and China. The U.S. would protest what we saw as human rights abuses of the Tiananmen Square massacre. However, this would not result in any kind of diplomatic isolation or sanctions against China. The Americans and others did not want to damage their trade links with the People's Republic of China. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, China would become the dominant power in the Western Pacific and the leader of other communist nations. New Chinese leadership focused on development as a world power and not as a leader of international revolution. So the hope that China formerly had, and that Mao had, that China would be a leader of global communism, started to fade as more modern leaders of China wanted to be leaders of global economics and actually market economics. So China is now an established economic power, and they gained most favored nation status from the United States, which means they are as close a trading partner as anybody else that we could have in 1992. And that's it for Sino-American relations. Thanks for listening, and tune in for more soon.